Will you guys pray with me as we come to God's word? Jesus, thank you for sending your Spirit to dwell with us, to live in us, to be our teacher, our guide, our counselor. And we want to hear from you. We want to listen to you. We want to follow Jesus. And we know we need you for that. We're dependent on you. And so, Spirit, we humble ourselves right now, and we release the things that would be barriers between us and you. We ask for open ears to hear from you and your word. We ask for hearts that are ready to see Jesus and follow him. And we love you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so Deuteronomy 11. Last week we talked about how this is Moses' sort of final speech as he gets ready to present the law. Right? So as we're going to look at Deuteronomy 11, I wanted to give us like a 30-second overview and then share 3 observations that come from the text. And that's what we're going to do today. And so for our 30-second overview, we can turn to the end of the speech, the last few things he says. Moses, speaking to Israel, says, "For you are to cross over the Jordan to go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you. When you possess it and live in it, you will be careful to do all the statutes and the rules that I am setting before you today." That's his speech in a nutshell. He's saying, you're about to go into the promised land. It's so good. But if you want to live there, then you need to be right with God, and you need to listen to what God says as I go through this law and I rehash it for us as we think about moving into the promised land. And that's Deuteronomy 11. So the 3 observations that we're going to make are all sort of united around this theme of getting ready to listen to the law and go into the land. The 3 observations, the principles I think we can hear from this too, is first that the Lord is speaking to you. Moses is going to speak to Israel, and he's going to say, God is speaking to you. Not to somebody else, he's speaking to you. Second, that the Lord's promise is a good one. It's not subpar. It's not a Ponzi scheme. It's actually good. And then lastly, that the different gods that you encounter are not going to be obvious. They're going to be deceptive. So those 3 things are what we're going after today. The first one is that the Lord speaks to you. And we see that because Moses says that the Lord, Yahweh, is speaking to adult Israel. He's not talking to their kids. In verse 2, we read, "Consider today, since I'm not speaking to your children who have not known or seen it, consider the discipline of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his outstretched arm, his signs and his deeds that he did in Egypt to Pharaoh the king of Egypt and to all his land." And so if we focus in for a second, he's clarifying in this big crowd in front of him who it is he's actually talking to. He's got men, he's got women, he's got children. And he's saying, okay, set aside the children for a second. Pay attention, men and women. You're in your 30s through your 40s, this group that he's talking to. He's like, you were there when you saw all of these different wonders and signs. So you were there when you saw God part the Red Sea. You were a little kid at that point. And you saw what happened when you came through and you were safe, and you look back and the waters closed on the Egyptians. They died. God protected you. You were there when you were learning the lessons in the wilderness about how God provides bread, God provides water, God provides meat. Then you came to the mountain of God, and it thundered with the voice of God, and he spoke to you at the mountain. You were there. You remember these things. And you remember what happened when people rebelled against Moses. You remember what happened, how God judged that very severely. And he separated them from his promises. He separated them by swallowing them up with the earth. That's crazy. And you saw it. And so I'm talking to you. I'm not talking to your kids. I'm talking to you. Verse 7, he says, "For your eyes have seen all the great things, all the great works of the Lord that he did." And so this is what Moses wants them to do with that. He's got their attention. They know they're talking to him. They're thinking back to the stories and their own memories. He says, "You shall therefore keep the whole commandment that I command you today, that you may be strong and go in to take possession of the land that you're going over to possess." So now I've got your attention. You remember the stories of how I worked in your life. What I want you to do with that is to listen to my law. And this is Moses' overarching speech, right? That's the point he's making. I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying to you. This law is for you. I'm not talking to your kids. I'm talking to you. You're the ones who have the experience with God, and it's your responsibility to take that experience and not forget about it, but to now redirect your attention to the way of God moving forward, to the laws of God moving forward, and listen to them and pay attention. To learn the lesson that God disciplines wickedness, but God is powerful to rescue and powerful to save, so cling to him. But then he says something else. He goes on, and this is skipping down to verse 19. He says, "You will teach these laws, these commandments to your children, talking of them when you are sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, when you lie down, when you rise." And the reason you're going to do this is so that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, as long as the heavens are above the earth. So this second generation of Israel has this sort of unique spot in history where they got to see all these incredible things that God did firsthand. And now it's their responsibility to learn the lessons from those firsthand and then to live in faithfulness to the law of God. Because third generation Israel is not going to get to repeat those miraculous wonders. Third generation of Israel is dependent on their passing on the faithfulness of God spoken in his word. Third generation of Israel is dependent on the law of God being faithfully lived and absorbed into their parents, and then their parents carrying it, like passing it on to them. And this is God's sort of like, I think this is God's pattern that he's setting for us moving forward. That this has happened, but my law, my word, is now spoken to be passed on from generation to generation to generation. So the Lord speaks to adult Israel directly. He doesn't want them to be like pointing at their kids and saying, hey, pay attention to this, listen to this. He wants them to be absorbing it and saying, this is about me. This is a call for me to action. But it's not just about me. It's about as I follow Yahweh, I'm going to encourage my children to come follow Yahweh with me. And that tracks with the way that Jesus treats us. Like that's the way that Jesus interacts with us. He actually calls to us and he speaks to us directly, and he wants to have us hear him, not just like point to other people and say, oh, this is really good for so-and-so. He wants us to listen, but he doesn't just want us to stay absorbed in this one-on-one relationship with him. He actually is equipping us to pass that on to others as well. He wants us to be disciple makers. And I like the way Paul puts it. In 2 Corinthians 5:18, we read Paul describing this calling that he has and the gospel of Jesus. He's talking about these things, and he says, all of this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself. Right? So there's the personal. Like Paul, when he's talking to his mentees or his followers, Titus and Timothy, he's like, guys, I'm the worst of the sinners. It's not like you guys are screwed up, but I got it right. He's like, no, Jesus reconciled me. Jesus spoke to me. Jesus' death was for me. His resurrection was for me. He is my king. I'm restored to God. I have no shame. I have no guilt. It's for me. But it's not just about me. It's also about my gathering others into that reconciliation. I've been called into this love so that I can pass this love on. I've been called into this relationship with God so I can include others in this relationship with God. And so he goes on and he says, Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. And so if this continues, then Jesus is still speaking to us. His Spirit is still speaking to us. He's still reconciling us, you and me, directly to the Father. And then he is equipping us and calling us to join him in bringing others into that same relationship. Just like Moses called second generation of Israel, he said, what you've received, pass on to your children. So as I was reading, this is the first observation, that the Lord speaks to us, and he does this for others' sake. Now, the second one that I had as you're going through was that the Lord's promise was actually a good promise. The land of Canaan, as he describes it here in Deuteronomy 11, he actually describes it, it's better than whatever Israel's known before. So over in Deuteronomy 11. This next passage is a little long, but I want to read it in full. It's verses 8 through 12. It says, "You shall therefore keep the whole commandment that I command you today, that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their offspring, a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land that you're entering to take possession of, it's not like the land of Egypt, from which you've come, where you sowed your seed and you irrigated it like a garden of vegetables. But the land that you are going over to possess, it's a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water by the rain from heaven, a land that the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year." We recently watched The Voyage of the Dawn Treader with C.S. Lewis's, is that his fourth or fifth book in his series, something like that, The Chronicles of Narnia. And in it, there's a part where the trip is coming to an end, and the Dawn Treader, the ship, is arriving at this shore. And on the other side, or on the shore, is Aslan's country. And Aslan's country is beautiful, and it's idyllic, and all these different things. And that's the picture, that's the idea of Deuteronomy 11's description of the Promised Land. This is really idyllic. This is God's country. This is the place where he's always looking. It's like his garden that he's taking care of. That's the language that's being used. It's like, this is not Egypt. This is God's country. And so he talks about the milk and the honey flowing there. And I don't know if you're lactose sensitive or lactose intolerant, and so then, like milk, big deal. That's not really the idea. I think it's good. It's a fertile land. It's the best of the best. Other ancient texts would use this almost as an idiom for, this is a utopia. This is such fertile ground. And so he's saying, this is the land I've prepared for you. It's so good. And then he compares it to Egypt. And I like this comparison a lot, because he's like, in Egypt, everything's flat. And you can grow gardens there really, kind of easily, as long as you irrigate the place. But you have to irrigate Egypt, because most of Egypt is a giant desert. You have the Nile River, that provides some water, but other than that, you just got a bunch of sand. And so the only way that you can start growing plants is by pulling the water from the Nile. And you've got to wrestle the water from the Nile into land. And the Egyptians were honestly, they developed some pretty incredible systems for doing this. It's cool. But they brought that water away from, they had to pull that from the Nile to get that to a place where they could then plant crops around the Nile. And the rest of it is a giant desert, giant wilderness. He's like, this isn't that kind of land. This is a land that God shows up every morning and he waters it for you. And he shows up every evening and he waters it for you. And over the course of the year, he has early rains and he has later rains. He takes care of the land. This isn't like Egypt. This is a land that is under the supervision and the caretaking of God himself. And so you get this picture of the two different places, right? And so Canaan is this beautiful space. Egypt is this sort of desert space that's been fixed to have crops and stuff. And it brings this reality in front of Israel, that the land they're going towards is a land that is teaching them about dependence on God. So, verse 16. "Take care lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and you serve other gods and worship them. And then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain." Egypt, that's not a terribly big deal. In a way, Egypt is sort of built off of that premise, that there's not going to be rain. And so we've got to make the best of the situation that we have. But Canaan, if it stops raining, nothing's going to grow there. The water's all going to drain out of the hills, go through the valleys, run off, and you're going to have famine. The land itself is going to teach Israel the principles of dependence on God that they've been learning about as they've been journeying in the wilderness itself, right? And the land is like, I don't know, I like seeing this picture. This is helpful for me. But the land is not a wilderness conquered like Egypt. The land is the garden restored. The land of Canaan is Moses saying, this is like going back to the Garden of Eden. This is like us being welcomed back into the garden that God made for his people to live in, but we lost out on. Why? Because we chose not to be dependent on him. We chose to try to decide good and evil for ourselves, to try to be like him, treat him as an equal, and in doing that, we ended up in a wilderness where we got really good at being dependent on ourselves. We made the best out of that situation. But that's not what God desires for you, and that's not God's promise for you. His promise is actually restoration to the wonder of Eden. Okay? So God, the Lord's promised land is better than what Israel has known, whether it be Egypt or whether it be the wilderness. And we pull this forward to Jesus, and Jesus promised us a life that's better than what we've known. I don't know if the church has always done this well, has always described eternity very well in a way that excites us for wanting to be there. But can you imagine, say, Moses gathering these people, and they're standing there on this side of the Jordan River. They're looking over there. Moses describes the promised land, and they're like, I don't know, the desert was kind of nice. Right? Like, that's not what happens. The promised land, the promised life in the land is actually desirable. It's wonderful. And then when you follow that picture across the story of the Bible, over and over again, the picture of eternity is not clouds and not even very often golden cities, where we gather in the courtroom of God and sing songs. More often, the picture of eternity is Canaan, is the promised land. And so, what's your favorite meal? Anybody want to shout one out? You know what? I had pizza. Thank you, Jerry. Now, I can't say pizza. It's too normal. But I guess we can. We'll go with pizza. I love pizza. I love a good pizza. Okay? The picture of eternity, the first picture we get, if you want to use Jesus as an example of eternity, is Jesus sitting down and eating some fish with his disciples. It's a meal. And he enjoys what the fishermen enjoy, which is a fishy meal. I don't like fish. He would have had pizza with me. Jerry and I would have sat down for a pizza, and Jesus would have been like, this is going to be good. The promised land is better than what we've known. The hill country is C.S. Lewis describes it as this call to go further in, further up, and further in. There's more to explore. There's more to find. And Jesus says the center of this promised land, the center of this promised life that I'm offering and I'm excited to offer to you and welcome you into, it's knowing me and it's knowing my Father. And we are the center of the promised land. And the backdrop behind all that is a table set with your favorite foods. And it's a country full for hiking. And it's occupation worth investing in. And it's the removal of wilderness, where you're having to fight against the land and you're having to fight against those things. The promised land is wonderful. It is a life worth getting excited over. And it's something that we're called into to enjoy. And so Paul again describing this. Let's see. I got carried away. All right, so Paul describing this in 2 Corinthians. He's talking to the Corinthians. He's talking to Roman people who are they're beginning Western civilization and stuff. So he's talking to people who think a little bit more like us. And he says, for while we are still in this tent, and he's talking about our bodies, right? So he's talking about our physical selves. While we're still in this physical reality, this physical sense, we groan and we're burdened. Not that we would remove ourselves from our bodies, not that we'd become less physical, not that we'd be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, that we'd get better bodies, that we'd have a more physical, more healthy, more vibrant existence to enjoy the grass and the sun that God created and the beautiful nightscapes and I don't know, to enjoy the beauty of his world that he made and he said was good. He says, so that what is mortal, what is dying, would be swallowed up by life. I think the church sometimes struggles to cast a vision for eternity that's compelling. We're not just going to be singing forever. Singing is great. It's in a courtroom of God, and the courtroom is one space. But he's got an entire universe that he's created. All right, so the promised life that Jesus gives us, it's better than what we've known. It's something to be excited about. And lastly, is the gods will be deceptive. Let's go back to our passage. We looked at it a second ago. Deuteronomy 11:16. Take care, lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods, and you worship them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he'll shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain. Now, the story of Israel plays out, and they get this warning. Make sure that you don't get into too much idolatry. Like, probably don't do any. Don't mess around with that. And then they go and do it, right? And they get caught up in Baal worship. He's the god of Canaan, like fertility stuff. They get caught up in Asherah worship. She's like another fertility, like the flip side of that fertility idea in the area, right? So they start doing these things, and I can't help but feel like when I look back and be like, how stupid and dense, you know? Like, how obvious is it to just not worship Baal if God calls you not to worship other gods, right? It just seems so, I don't know. But I think that's the wrong question, because Moses tells Israel that it's actually deceptive. There's the deceptive component to idolatry. And so the right question is not how could Israel be so dense. The right question, I think, is how did Israel get deceived? How did they get tricked? The nature, I think, of being deceived and being tricked is you've got this handle on the truth, and you're confident, right? Like, you're confident you're right. And then it turns out that somebody's misled you. So you're looking at your worldview, and you're like, I got no chinks in my worldview, right? This is accurate. This is wisdom. This is truth. And then it turns out that actually inside of that wisdom and truth worldview that you've developed, there's these lies that were intentionally put there so that you would think that they made sense. You would think that you're holding on to some sort of wisdom, but actually you were being led away from Jesus, led away from the Lord. And so how did Israel end up in that space where they got to the point that they thought that worshiping the Lord plus Baal was wisdom? The worshiping the Lord plus, like having a good Asherah pole outside of the temple, that's just the right way of being in the Promised Land. And I'm going to take a stab at answering that based off of Deuteronomy 11 and then the stories of Israel. I think it's because they prioritized and misinterpreted the blessings of the Promised Land. At Christmas, we give gifts to each other. So, and kids are always so excited about this, but honestly, I'm still excited about it. So kids get really excited around this gift-giving thing. And one of the things that we're always trying to teach our kids, or trying to reinforce before Christmas comes up, is something more important than the gift you get is the person giving you the gift. Like, the gift is supposed to be an expression of that person's love for you. So it doesn't matter if you get the thing you want or if you get something else. Like, see that person loving you. And we invariably are going to get this wrong. Like, the kids are invariably going to get it wrong. I'm going to get it wrong, right? When we were growing up, my grandma would always give us underwear and socks. And it was really hard to be thankful for the underwear and socks. But our parents were like, nope, you have to say thank you, because it's not about the gift, it's about the giver. It's about the person giving it to you. And that gift giving is helpful here, because God is essentially promising to Israel a gift. He's saying, I'm going to put you in the Promised Land, I'm going to take care of you, I'm going to give this great gift. And Israel can do two things. Can prioritize the gift over the relationship with the Lord, and in doing that, is going to look for a way to get the gift without the strings attached to it. Right? I don't want to say thank you to Yahweh. I don't want to worship the Lord. I don't want to follow his ways, but I do want the gift. That can lead to idolatry. How else can I get this? Who else could I worship in order to have access to this gift? Another thing that could happen is Israel could misinterpret where the gift comes from. When our kids are opening gifts, sometimes it happens so fast. We're like, who gave that to you? And they're like, I have no idea. I wasn't paying attention. Right? I just opened it. And then we're sorting through the wrapping paper trying to find it, and we don't know where it came from either. But imagine you were the one who gave my kid a gift. Imagine you were the one who had set aside and had given this one thing. You got out of your way. Like, we don't always do that sort of thing with other people's families at Christmas. And so it's kind of special that people would do that. And so you gave it to my kids, and they ripped through it so fast that they didn't even see who it was. And I had watched it happen. And they opened it up, and you were watching, I'm watching, we're excited with them, and they're like, wait a minute, who gave it to me? And before you have a chance to respond, I say, I did. I gave that to you. And I steal that thankfulness right in that moment. They're so excited because you nailed it. You really found the right gift for my kids. But I'm like, no, I gave it to you. And then they rush to me and give me the hug and say, thank you to me. All the while, you were the one who gave them the gift. And that's, again, the picture of how idolatry works. Because there are spiritual forces behind idolatry, behind false worship that are trying to steal the affection, steal the love, steal the worship that belongs to the Lord from us and from Israel. And so Israel was deceived. Israel was tricked. And they got into a point where the rain that's promised in Deuteronomy 11, the rain was something that they get into the land. And that became more important to them. The fertility of the land was more important than the relationship with Yahweh. So they want to figure out how to control that as best they can. And when the rain doesn't come right away, some, like previous local says something like, well, have you gone through the cultic prayers? Like, well, no. He's like, oh, you mean you just colonized this land and you just came in here and conquered and you're just going to do everything your way? No, you've got to follow the stuff that's natural to this space. And they say, oh, I guess that makes sense. That's wisdom. So Yahweh gave us this land, but in order to handle the land well, of course, we have to also appease Baal. So Yahweh plus Baal leads to rain. Even though God has said, have a unique, personal, one-off relationship with me. All right. That's fairly different than probably your and my experience in terms of like the things that we think about. I don't know how often we're thinking about worshiping Baal or not worshiping Baal when we're thinking about rain. But 1 Corinthians, Paul says this when he's talking actually about one of Deuteronomy 11's examples of things that God has done to teach Israel. He says this, he said, these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. And if you read the rest of 1 Corinthians 10, you know what comes up over and over again? Idolatry. Worshipping false gods is a major theme of 1 Corinthians 10. What's mixed in with 1 Corinthians 10 and its idolatry is dismissal of other people and their consciences. Not loving each other well, prioritizing truth to such an extent you're like, I'm right, and it doesn't matter what you think. All this stuff is sort of intertwined and mixed together, and he says, be careful, learn from the examples of Israel that got caught up in idolatry, and like Moses warned, they then lost the land. They lost the promises. All of this is a warning for us because that temptation to idolatry is no different. It's a common one. It's one that we're going to have to face as well. And because it's deception, because it's deceptive, it's not something that we can see very easily. It's not going to be something that it's just, yeah, I'm sorry, small group. I'm an idolater, so I that's kind of what I do. I mix my idolatry with this, and we don't know what we're doing. We're tricked into it. But I think it's when we follow the same pattern that Israel follows. Israel's pattern was they understood that truth and wisdom looked like the Lord plus Baal equals rain in Canaan, right? And that led them into idolatry. Well, how would we be deceived? It would be when we prioritize, or when you and I misinterpret things, blessings that come from God, and we give credit to that to other things, or when we think that those gifts and blessings from God are more important than the actual relationship with God. That would be when we get tricked into joining Israel and thinking that the Lord plus Baal equals rain in Canaan. And so for us, it's going to be Jesus plus something equals the good life. Jesus plus something is the way that we get to the blessings of God, the way that we get the blessings of the gospel, the way that we get a good way of living in this world. That feels fairly abstract, I think, right? And so maybe your minds are wandering to places where okay, what would this something be for you? And that's good. We should do that. I want to give 4 examples just to kind of give an example of how I've been thinking about this and like to tie it down a little bit to maybe some more concrete things. All 4 of these things are very good things. But I think that they become idols when we think about them with this formula. Jesus plus this thing is how we get the blessings of God, the good life. The first one is productivity. I think the church struggles with this. I think I struggle with this. I think the U.S. Protestant work ethic culture struggles with this. Jesus plus productivity, that's how you get the good life. If you have Jesus, but you're not a productive person, then it's easy for me to shake my head at you and dismiss you off to the side and say, we'll see what God does with that person. And probably I don't run that script in my mind, but that's the way I act. That's the way we act. If a person isn't productive and then they end up with all these issues on their life later on, I think people in the church sometimes nod along and say, well, you can't just trust in Jesus. You have to then be a productive person. If you don't engage in discipleship, if you don't engage in missions, if you don't lead the Bible study, if you don't ... do this thing, then, well, you're not truly going to get the real good life. Like, you'll be on like the 2nd level Christian or something weird like that. And I think, okay, so that's one, right? I'll put that one out there, and I'm going to toss this one as an opposite side. Jesus plus rest equals the good life. And this is sort of more reactionary to the way that the U.S. church has been. But sometimes we see me time, self-care, my comfort Friday night with Netflix, that stuff. If I don't get that, then I have every right on Saturday to be grumpy, to be like mean to my kids, to be like closeted off. I can't just have Jesus. I have to have Jesus plus my self-care. Okay? And if we think that is like the true path forward of wisdom and truth, that's what gets us to the point where we're living the full Christian life. That's a symptom of false worship, I think. It's a symptom of idolatry that's very similar to the way that Israel thought about Baal. So I think we need to ask some diagnostic questions. Before we do the next 2, we can ask ourselves questions like, when I'm looking at somebody else's life and I'm seeing it crash and burn, okay? Do I judge them against productivity or do I judge them against rest? And is that the defining thing that I shake my head at and say, you know what, if they had done this, their life would have been better. If they had done this, then they would have had a whole good discipleship relationship with Jesus. And so we judge other people against this thing, and that's more important to us than simply whether or not they are trusting in Jesus or they're trying to wrap their life around him. Another way of testing it would be if Jesus ever challenges our productivity, or if Jesus ever challenges our rest, who wins? Jesus did both of these things. He challenged the religious activism and the religious busyness of the Pharisees. And when they came to him and they said, what's up with your disciples? They're not following all the different scripts. He was like, that's not the heart of the kingdom. Like, you're just making burdens and putting them on people and not lifting your finger to truly do them yourself. He challenges that sort of like productivity for productivity's sake. But then on the other side, when they came to him and they said, what are you doing? Why are your disciples not resting on the Sabbath? How could you heal somebody on the Sabbath? Jesus is like, if my Father continues to work on the Sabbath, then I will follow him and work on the Sabbath. And that's a challenge to the rest dynamic, right? Rest in and of itself, the Sabbath in and of itself, is not our salvation. Neither is productivity. So the diagnostic questions we ask are, do I judge other people against this thing as the ultimate path to the good life? This is the most important thing practically. And secondly, if that thing ever comes up against Jesus, will I listen to Jesus or will I follow my rhythm of productivity, my rhythm of rest? Again, I want to reiterate that lean towards the church deals more with productivity issues than it does with rest issues. We're probably more likely to overwork a person and tell them, be better, do more, and neglect the call to rest than we are the other way around. But rest in and of itself is not salvation. Okay, last two. Jesus plus family equals the good life. I think this is, I've been talking about this week with Bree, with a couple other people. When I think about idols in the church, I think family is probably up there as one of the most sneaky and deceptive. Because James Dobson has told us the path to the good life. And it's not challenged. It's not critiqued. And so if Jesus ever has to go toe-to-toe with James Dobson, I'm not sure who's going to come out winning. The family is so important in the church, in at least maybe like the Western Protestant church, that we judge everybody against it. And we dismiss people when they don't meet our standards and when they don't serve and bow down to family. I don't know, do you ever do that? Do you ever like say come to Jesus and Jesus versus family, and Jesus says, well, you need to hate your mother and father and love me. And we're like, well, Jesus, that's a little crazy. I'm sorry. We're going to set that one aside and go over to your other calls to love God and love others. Jesus said, undying devotion to me might mean dying devotion to family. And he has every right to say that to us. Jesus never promised family to anybody. Jesus said, you might give up your family for me, and if you do, I offer you the church as a place, a family for you. I offer you family with God. I will be your brother. I will be your husband. I will be your Savior and your King. I'll welcome you. But you might give up family for me, and that's okay. Are we okay with that? Do we ever look at people and if their life crashes and burn and we analyze it and say, you know what, they didn't care for their family the way that we think they should have. They didn't, he was never at the house enough. He wasn't invested enough in his kids. He wasn't, and that's the reason his life crashed and burned. Or the flip side of that, when a person's family life is perfect and idyllic and everything, and then something goes terribly wrong in their life, is there something inside of us that just is like really freaked out? How could it go wrong if you did everything right? Like if you served family well, how could your life not end in blessing? Those are symptoms of idolatry. And the solution is not singleness. Again, I think that the family piece is probably the bigger issue, the bigger idol. But the fix for idolatry is not idolatry of singleness. Paul said that, there's two vocations that God might call you to. He might call you to marriage. That is a good calling. He may call you to singleness. That's a better calling. It would be better and it would be a more holistic life if you were called to singleness. And that's weird. Okay, that's hard to wrap my head around, honestly. I think that goes to show how embedded I am in this idea that family is the center of the Christian life. But Paul is not there. Paul says singleness is actually the higher calling of the two. And the reason for that is you're allowed to focus on the gospel and focus on Jesus without distraction. Okay? So does that mean that we should raise singleness as the epitome of faith and the epitome of religion and the epitome of where the church just needs to make more single people and make them more focused on God and they just need to date Jesus and be satisfied? No. Jesus plus singleness is not equal to good life. All right, so all this is coming from Deuteronomy. He challenges us. He says, false gods, they're deceptive. They get in under your skin, and you think you got a good handle on truth and wisdom. but actually you find yourself worshiping somebody other than Yahweh, and you've stolen the love that belongs to him. You've misinterpreted the gift as the end in of itself. How do you put all that together? And I want to say it's a whole lot easier to criticize than it is to construct and it is to build. But I think this is a step in the right direction. We need to understand that Jesus is the good life. Jesus is the promised land. Jesus is our Canaan. The salvation and the rescue that comes from his death and his resurrection is the fullness of our life. Jesus' love for us is the satisfying response to our heart's cry for belonging. He's the one who offers us security. He's the one who offers us recognition in the courtroom of God. It's Jesus. Jesus is the good life. And because we've been called, he then turns to us and says, come be in relationship with me. He also says, come follow me. And Jesus leads us into things like he is at work, and so we produce. When we follow Jesus, he leads us into a productive life. He leads us in ways of bearing fruit in his kingdom. Abiding in Jesus in John 15 is synonymous with bearing fruit in his kingdom and loving those around us. Jesus leads us to productivity, not when we try to get the good life through Jesus and productivity, but when we want Jesus and we follow him wherever he goes. Same thing with rest. When we follow Jesus, he leads us to rest. He leads us to not finding our identity in what we can produce and what we can create and what we can make and offer the world and do in the church. No, none of that. You're you. Jesus knows you. He says, I offer you rest. Come follow me. Jesus leads us into staying single and not wanting any more than that. Maybe we want more than that, but we learn contentment. We learn dependence on Jesus. And we follow him into wherever that singleness leads as a blessing to the world around us, as a pursuit of intimacy with Jesus and God. And it's valid, and it's a full life. Not because of singleness, but because of Jesus. And Jesus built a family in the church. And so sometimes Jesus leads us in the calling of family, whether that be aunts and uncles, husbands and wives, whether that be children, whether it be loving our parents. This family goes in all these different directions. And Jesus, as we follow him, leads us into love for our family as well. But it's not because family saves us or family is the end in of itself. It's because we are following Jesus where he goes. Truth and wisdom is a salvation that's grounded, a faith that's grounded on Jesus. And wherever Jesus leads us, we follow him. Deuteronomy 11 says, Yahweh is leading us into the promised land. So come listen to Yahweh. And I think Scripture as a whole says Jesus is leading us into the promised life. So come listen to Jesus. Will you pray with me?